I want to go over some of the rules of the debate before we get started. We have about 11 pre-scripted questions. We may not get to all of them, but I want to give you each a minute to respond to that. There's no opening statements. And I'd also ask if you could speak slowly and clearly for our interpreters as well. And a reminder that the host organizations and our viewers really want to know where your party stands on these issues. So if you want to add what you would do as an individual to advance these issues within your party or parliament, that's fine, but we would prefer if you start with your party's position. We also have media and participants that have an opportunity to ask their own questions at the end of the debate. You can do that by using the Q&A function to submit a question. That's also at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote your favorite questions so we can see those come to the top. And a reminder that this debate is brought to you by charities. So questions that are partisan, meaning they support or oppose a party or candidate, those will be removed. We may only have time for one or two of those questions, but the candidates here will be able to see them and consider them as issues that we all and Canadians all believe are important. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you once again. Welcome, everyone. And our first question is about wildlife captivity and entertainment. Canada banned whale and dolphin captivity in 2019. Similar legislation, Bill S-15, which would have banned elephant and great ape captivity, passed Senate late last year, but it failed to pass through the House of Commons before this election was called. Would your party commit to bringing back Bill S-15 and passing it or similar legislation to ban the keeping of elephants, great apes, and potentially other species, such as big cats that do not thrive in captivity? And I'll start with Mr. Erskine Smith. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks for hosting this, to all the organizations that helped put this together, and for everyone who's joining here. It's you rightly said it's an issue that is under discussed sometimes in elections, but it's an issue that really matters nonetheless. And I'm glad that we're all joining here. And to your specific question, I had the good fortune of being the House sponsor of the Jane Goodall Act when it was a private member's bill. Murray Sinclair was the senator who had introduced it, and the government adopted a version of that through S-15. And if we have the luck of being reelected, and you'll certainly see, it's not in the platform, which I would be interested in getting to a conversation about what's in platforms and what's not, but there is a commitment to reintroduce and to pass S-15.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. MacGregor, you're up next.
In a short answer, yes, but I would also like to echo Nathaniel's comments in thanking the organizations for hosting us. I was very privileged to be a part of the 2021 debate, and it's great to see this kind of a focus on these particular issues, which I know are really important to Canadians. It is a shame that the House of Commons schedule was a bit of a mess last year, and that this bill only did get through the Senate. But to just expand on your question, I think there are so many opportunities that Canadians have to learn about these magnificent animals as they live in their home environments, their natural environments, without subjecting them to captivity. And I think that should be the underlying premise for how we deal with this issue.
Ms. May?
Thanks so much for the question. And I'm glad it started with the bill that I sponsored through the House in concert with the Senate. So it was a bill that started in the Senate, for people who pay attention to these things and the trivia of it, a bill that has an S- number, starts in the Senate, C- number, starts in the Commons. So it was in concert with two wonderful senators, the late Senator Murray Sinclair and Senator Wilfred Moore from Nova Scotia. The bill started in the Senate as S-203, and that's one of the strongest pieces of animal rights legislation in the world. The bill that banned the keeping of cetaceans in captivity is one of the only pieces of legislation in the world that, or maybe the only, that recognizes the rights of an individual animal. Because in making decisions about whether an animal can be taken in, a whale, dolphin, or porpoise, captivity for purposes of medical treatment, the question is the best interests of that animal. Yes, of course, I want to see Bill S-15, the Jane Goodall Act. I want to see it passed. We support it coming back to the House. I will make reference throughout the debate to what's in our actual platform in terms of recognizing the rights of sentient beings. You can find our animal rights policies on page 33 of the English version of the platform, and on page 37 dans la version française. Alors, je termine là parce que c'est 1 minute 20 secondes.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Perron?
Oui, merci beaucoup de cette opportunité d'être au débat. Merci aux organisateurs, c'est très apprécié. Écoutez, le Bloc québécois est tout à fait ouvert à étudier le principe, très favorable d'ailleurs au principe. On avait voté d'ailleurs dans cette intention-là. Et ce qui est important dans ces enjeux de captivité-là, il y a le bien-être animal, bien sûr, doit être mis en avant-plan toujours, mais au-delà de ça aussi, les enjeux de santé publique. Vous savez que l'OMS juge que 70% de toutes les maladies infectieuses émergentes chez les humains proviennent d'animaux sauvages. Donc, quand on laisse faire le commerce de ces animaux-là à l'international, on augmente le risque aussi pour la santé publique. On a différents exemples là-dedans. L'enjeu avec le Bloc québécois, vous ne serez pas surpris de m'entendre soulever cet enjeu-là, c'est qu'il y a déjà beaucoup de réglementations dans certaines provinces et particulièrement au Québec. Donc, nous, on est favorable, évidemment, à l'idée, mais toujours, évidemment, dans le respect des compétences et de ce qui existe déjà dans la juridiction québécoise. Merci.
Thank you for that. And for anyone who's just joining us now, I also want to repeat again that we do have interpretation available, and you can access that by clicking on the button at the bottom of your screen, either English or French. Choose the language that you'd like to hear interpretation in. Okay, moving on to our next question. It is about wildlife trade and fur farming. Canada imports and exports millions of wild animals and animal parts every year for the exotic pet trade, fashion, entertainment, and other purposes. And this drives biodiversity decline and the spread of zoonotic diseases and invasive species. The vast majority of new and emerging infectious diseases over the past decade has originated from animals and mainly wildlife. In addition, the intensive fur farming of wild animals not only causes immense animal suffering, but it's been identified as a key driver of pandemic risk. In 2021, the outbreaks of COVID-19 were detected on mink farms in several countries, including in Canada. And in response to that, British Columbia banned all mink farming. So my question is, what would your party do to address the wildlife trade? In addition, would your party support banning fur farming in Canada? This one will start with Mr. MacGregor.
Thank you. So you've got a two-part question here. So let's start with the first one. I think in the first one, with regards to the international wildlife trade, the answer to your question was actually in the preamble. As evidence has very clearly shown, international wildlife trade has led to habitat destruction, but it also has led to the introduction of very new and novel diseases, right? Diseases that survive in, say, a tropical habitat now are becoming a global phenomenon, and one of the corridors through which they are spread is through the international wildlife trade. So that is, I think, the answer to the question of why we have to look at this issue very seriously and really crack down on it, because there are a lot of unsavory characters that operate in it as well. On fur trade, I think it's great to be following the BC NDP's example here in my home province of British Columbia, when they did ban mink farming. And I think with all farming in particular, we need to step away from the what and the why and focus more on the how, as we treat all animal farming, is like how it is done, because there's a very wide spectrum on how farming is done in this country.
Okay, Ms. May?
Thanks so much. Again, the wildlife trade, and c'est dans la réponse déjà de Monsieur Perron. Nous avons une menace vers la santé publique. So we also, and Alistair mentioned it too, when we're looking at wildlife trade and wildlife markets, there's a very large risk to human health as well as the issues of the well-being and care for the animals themselves. So we favor a ban on the wildlife trade and fur farming within Canada. No question, it's a very small portion of our economy. Very few people rely on it. There's no reason not to move to ban fur farming. And that's the official position of the Green Party, although it didn't make it to our platform because we had to compress things. Just so you know, if you don't see it in the platform, please take my word for it. It's our policy.
Monsieur Perron?
Oui, merci, Madame Wong. Madame May parle de sa plateforme. J'ai le goût de vous parler de la mienne aussi. Je vous invite à aller la voir à blocquébécois.org. Elle est très belle aussi. Elle contient beaucoup de sujets. Et sur cette question très importante, évidemment, je me rends compte que j'ai touché dans ma réponse à la première question. Je vais aller peut-être un peu plus global. L'enjeu de santé est extrêmement important. Donc, moi, je pense qu'il faut agir là-dessus. Il faut légiférer. Il faut le faire correctement aussi. Il faut aussi, si on décide d'aller dans le sens d'interdire, évidemment, le commerce international d'espèces sauvages. Il faudrait y mettre les moyens. Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de ce commerce-là qui se fait de façon illégale et qui serait peut-être pas touché par la législation si on ne met pas les moyens pour essayer de le contrôler, évidemment. Puis quand on parle des enjeux de santé publique, c'est extrêmement important. En terminant, dans mon dernier 10 secondes, je vous rappellerai qu'il faut toujours aussi, quand on adoptera ces législations-là, être soucieux de ce qui existe dans les différentes provinces et au Québec pour que ce soit en arrimage et pas une imposition du fédéral.
Okay, Mr. Erskine Smith.
Well, I'll start with the Liberal position. I mean, the Liberal Party's long opposed illegal wildlife trade, and the 2021 platform made commitments around that. There have been regulations put in place in 2023 in some regards, at least. When I was telling party folks that I was doing this, I was saying, we don't have enough in the there's no animal commitments in the platform for reasons of the priority focus on Donald Trump and all things economic. And so I said, well, we've got to be committed to a range of different things on animals. On Easter Sunday, the Carney campaign put out a video saying that they were committed to protecting animals. And so I got language back specifically that says reduce the commercial trade in wild animals to address animal welfare, environmental, and health risks. And then on a personal note, let me just say, I've introduced legislation to ban fur farming. I've also introduced legislation to better draw the link between the wildlife trade and a One Health approach, this idea that animal health, human health, and environmental health are interconnected. And through the Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness Act, really focused on that connection and sought to phase out disproportionately risky activities like fur farming.
Okay, thank you. We'll move next to overseas horse exports. Canada breeds and transports horses to Japan for slaughter, where they are eaten as a raw delicacy in high-end restaurants. Banning the export of horses overseas for slaughter, it was introduced in the Minister of Agriculture's mandate letter in 2021. And then Bill C-355, which would have banned horse exports, passed in the House last year, but failed to pass through the Senate before this election was called. The question is, would your party support banning the overseas export of horses for slaughter? And for this, we'll start with Ms. May.
Absolutely. And Bill C-355 unfortunately died on the order paper January 6th. A lot of good bills died. We've got to bring them back fast. We should be able to prioritize, I would hope, by unanimous consent between parties, that some of those bills that died that have already passed the House be given priority to restart faster than having to start from scratch. That's something Parliament can do. It just takes political will. Banning the export of live horses, and God bless Jan Arden for making this an issue everybody understands. Horse shit, excuse me. We need to ban the live export of horses. It's an abomination. I don't think I need to say more. It's a priority.
Mr. Perron?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je suis très heureux que vous posiez la question, en fait. Nous, on a, au Bloc québécois, toujours priorisé le bien-être animal. Puis quand ce projet de loi-là a été déposé en premier lieu, on a soulevé des questions sur pourquoi seulement les chevaux, pourquoi seulement par avion. Mais on voulait faire une étude plus approfondie, ce qui n'était pas rendu possible dans les modifications du projet de loi. Donc, au départ, on s'est prononcé contre le principe. Et ensuite, on est allé étudier en comité. Puis après le travail en comité, vous avez certainement remarqué que le Bloc québécois a décidé de laisser passer la loi. Donc, notre position a évolué en cours d'étude sur cette question-là, mais notre préoccupation de départ compte toujours. C'est bien de dire on protège les chevaux, mais qu'en est-il des autres transports? Est-ce qu'on s'assure de toujours assurer de bonnes conditions de vie à nos animaux? Est-ce que c'est normal, par exemple, je vous donne un exemple, de transporter des bêtes jusqu'en Pennsylvanie pour les faire abattre? Il me semble qu'il y a quelque chose de très incohérent. Donc, évidemment, ça touche plus large. Mais pour la réponse à votre question, en bout de piste, on a laissé passer la loi. C'est triste, par contre, que le Canada ne soit pas une véritable démocratie et que le Sénat ait retenu plusieurs de nos projets de loi, dont celui sur la gestion de l'offre, dont on aura sûrement l'occasion de parler.
Mr. Erskine Smith?
Yeah, so this is a commitment that was in the 2021 platform. And if you backtrack further, and it's a credit to, as Elizabeth says, Jan Arden, but also more broadly, the Horse Defense Coalition. There are a lot of voices that really lean into this. And Elizabeth and I were part of an all-party animal welfare caucus that we put together. We heard direct testimony from experts in animal science that said there is no possibility of transporting horses in this manner in a humane way. No possibility. And with that evidence, we were able to secure a commitment in the platform. I credit to my colleague Tim Lewis for introducing a private member's bill. The bill should have been passed in the last parliament. It should have been passed. The reason it was not passed is because not just some random senator, but the conservative the conservative Senate leader, the leader of the conservatives in the Senate, spent months and months and months blocking that legislation. Otherwise, it would be passed. And if we are reelected, we are going to support that legislation and make it law.
Mr. MacGregor.
I was the lead spokesperson for the NDP in this bill. We supported it all the way through its journey in the House of Commons. And, as Nathaniel said, the shame is on the Senate side. And that's the problem with introducing this type of legislation as a private member's bill. Like, congratulations to Tim Lewis. Like, it was great that he did it. But I think it's a shame that it was in a ministerial mandate letter and it was relegated to a PMB, because PMBs don't get the same kind of prominence that a government bill was. So I think the next time around, a government has to make this part of government legislation. It gets priority in the House of Commons, but it also gets priority in the Senate. And you can't just hold it up like you can a private member's bill. So that's the way it should be done the next time around.
Okay,
I agree with that.
We're moving on to intensive animal agriculture. Raising animals in intensive farming systems where they live in crowded, barren environments and confined housing systems like gestation crates and battery cages. It causes immense animal suffering and it creates public health threats. And this is why many Canadians, when they learn about how the meat and eggs on their plate were raised, are looking towards their elected representatives to do something about intensive animal agriculture. The question is, what would your party do to address the problems associated with this type of farming? We'll start with Monsieur Perron.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette très importante question. Puis ça ramène l'élément que je ramène dans chacune des réponses depuis le début. Le bien-être animal, ça doit être au centre de toutes nos décisions et ça doit être notre première préoccupation. Quand ça devient trop intensif dans des conditions extrêmes où les animaux sont tassés les uns contre les autres, je pense pas que c'est acceptable. Nous, on a toujours été en faveur de maintenir des entreprises de taille familiale. C'est une des raisons pour lesquelles, vous savez, avec notre projet de loi sur la gestion de l'offre, on visait à protéger les fermes laitières qui ont en moyenne 80 vaches sur une entreprise plutôt que 10 000 aux États-Unis. On est ailleurs complètement. C'est un exemple que je vous donne pour vous dire l'ampleur de ça. Il y a aussi, je mentionnais tantôt, le long transport quand il est question d'abattage, des choses comme ça. Je pense qu'il faut travailler là-dessus puis développer une infrastructure de transformation régionale, entre autres pour l'abattage, qui augmenterait non seulement la qualité des produits puis l'accessibilité des produits régionaux pour la clientèle autour, mais qui augmenterait de beaucoup aussi la qualité de vie des animaux. Et le bien-être animal doit être au centre de toutes nos préoccupations. On est très favorable aussi à la production biologique. Là, j'ai oublié de mettre mon temps. Je ne sais pas ça fait combien de temps que je parle, mais je dois avoir fini ma minute. Mais vous comprenez un peu l'essentiel de notre position.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
Yeah, I think, look, this is the most challenging question we're likely to confront in this debate because there is such a serious economic case for, if any time I've touched animal welfare legislation, put it this way, there's an argument from a range of different industry to say it's the slippery slope, it's the thin edge of the wedge. What's next? What's next? And look, you got to acknowledge, and everyone should acknowledge, animal agriculture, there's people's livelihoods depend upon animal agriculture in this country. And I understand why people get their backs up when we start to talk about animal welfare sometimes. And so I think your question just around focusing on intensive animal agriculture and the negative health consequences, again, that One Health approach, Health Canada does some of this work through addressing antimicrobial resistance and overuse of antibiotics. But look, we have voluntary codes, frankly. And when you talk about battery cages, the voluntary code's set to phase it out by 2036. When you talk about gestation crates, the voluntary code was set to phase it out by 2024, and then industry shrugged their shoulders and said we can't do it in time, so it's 2029 now. I'm not speaking on behalf of the party here because they don't have a position on this, but I will say we all collectively need to make sure that those voluntary kinds of codes move away from being voluntary, that there's teeth to them, and that animal welfare is a component that gets real enforcement.
Mr. MacGregor.
Yeah, there's no question that economics is driving a lot of this, right? And we all know as elected representatives that food prices are a very sensitive subject, especially over the last few years. Like my constituents, so many of them, it's impacted both the quality and quantity of food that they've been able to purchase because of prices. So that's one thing that the government needs to focus on is, how do we make sure that people can afford to eat and feed their families? So how do we address this? Well, there are ways. The government could step in and give more legislative powers and oversight to things like the existing National Farm Animal Care Council. I've always maintained a really great working relationship with organizations like the Small Scale Meat Producers Association. They really try to focus on regenerative agriculture because we have to realize that healthy farming requires a holistic approach. It requires both plants and animals working together and trying to mimic the natural environment. And organizations like that, made of small, dedicated farmers, are really leading the way. And other farmers are more likely to listen to other farmers than an Ottawa knows best approach. So we have to keep that in mind as a part of this conversation.
Ms. May?
Yeah, I'm really pleased with the details in our platform this year on animal welfare to create independent ministry responsible for animal welfare, security, and separate from agriculture and agri-food, with comprehensive legislation that will deal with all aspects of farm animal housing and welfare, and also supporting farmers who want to transition from animal agriculture to sustainable plant-based agricultural practices. There's a lot of details here, but there's no question but that we have to recognize that we can't let the agricultural lobby keep blocking animal welfare legislation as it did to Nate's terrific bill back in 2015. And I thought, oh, it's coming from a Liberal MP, it'll get passed. So we have to recognize
Don't
that
remind me, Elizabeth. Don't
I know
remind me.
I'm reminding us all. It was awful, right? Horrible. But we have to look to the European Union, where agriculture is still a significant component of their economy. Agricultural producers survive on their income, which is very hard to do in Canada because we've made cheap food more important than healthy food. And as a result, you look at the EU, where they have minimum sizes for battery cages. They have strict rules for transport of livestock. Those are the regulations embraced by the Green Party of Canada. And we think it's really important to also point out, why are eggs more expensive in the US than here? Because of agricultural lobby success in the US, where there's no limit on how many hens you can have. You know, millions of egg producing poultry in a barn. That's why egg prices have gone out of sight in the US. And thanks to supply management in Canada and smaller agricultural production, our egg prices aren't a source of scandalous increase in prices. In fact, inflation in food in Canada has gone down recently. It's around the 2% mark, but we are facing a climate crisis, which also has to do with industrial livestock production. The climate crisis causes food inflation. So these are very interrelated issues. So we have to face it. We have to talk about it. I agree. We can't ignore the people in Canada that rely on industrial methods of agriculture to feed their own families. But we have to really put industrial intensive livestock operations under the microscope and point out that they're the source, not local production of livestock in small farms. That's not where we get deaths of listeriosis and spreading of significant illness in the human population. Small scale, sustainable agriculture can include animal agriculture, but industrial scale livestock operations and confined feedlots have to end.
Thank you, Ms. May. Let's move on to plant-based food. Canada's food guide encourages Canadians to eat more plant-based food. And this is not only good for our health, but it also helps to address climate change. Yet Canada's plant-based food sector receives far less government support than the animal agriculture sector. The question is, would your party support increased federal government investment in the plant-based food sector? Mr. Erskine Smith.
Yeah, I'll say a couple different things. So one is, I think it was an incredibly important step to put the food guide as it is in place. It was subjected to a lot of lobby pressure the other way, and the government rightly stood its ground and said, no, we want it to be science-based, which of course means that it's more plant-based and principally plant-based. The second thing is to say there have been some efforts to operationalize the food guide, but I would say certainly not enough. And so we've seen over $150 million in funding directed towards innovation in the plant-based space. My own view is I think we can, be a bit more strategic about the funding, and I'll give an example and leave it at that. In 2011, the Harper government actually, they gave money to Colleges and Institutes Canada to basically update culinary curricula all across this country to reduce sodium. And I think there's an opportunity, and if I'm reelected, I'll certainly try to secure funding in this way to ensure that we are doing the same thing, same model, but we're updating the culinary curricula to be training the chefs of tomorrow to be familiar with and to incorporate the food guide and to be more familiar with plant-based. Because I think there are more strategic ways we can drive change and operationalize the food guide, including in the last thing I'll say is just on the National School Food Program. When we are federally, which we aren't always, but when we are in the space of food and directing food programming, we should make sure that it's consistent with our own policy, the food guide.
Mr. MacGregor.
Well, as a former Canadian Produce Marketing Association produce champion, absolutely yes. I think it's fantastic that the food guide recommends that half your plate be fruits and vegetables. And look, we've got tremendous capacity in Canada. And this is a moment in time, right, with the trade war that's going on with the United States and the fact that we rely on so much produce and fruit coming up from the United States. This is a time when we can look to build resiliency in local economies. And I know there are so many farmers who are growing those fresh fruit and vegetables who would love to fill in that gap. So they absolutely do need supports. I've been very happy to work with the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. I've worked with the Canadian Organic Trade Association. We need an organic strategy for Canada. But we also have to pay attention to Canada's business risk management programs because farmers who are growing fruits and vegetables are particularly susceptible to the ravages of climate change. And the farmers will be the first ones to tell you they are on the front lines of climate change. They need to have nimble and adaptive business risk management programs to help support the sector when they are hit by those climate catastrophes. But otherwise, yes, we have tremendous potential. We should make sure that we are living up to the Canada Food Guide and supporting our hardworking farmers who are producing that amazing produce right across this great country of ours.
Ms. May?
I totally agree with what my colleagues have said. We need to have more focus and financial support for those portions of our healthy diet to educate people. And I'm very glad about the school food program, but like I just boast about my own riding for a minute. Salt Spring Island, Gulf Island Secondary School has a community garden as part of the school program. Kids get course credit for growing food organically, but then they get course credit for having in the school cafeteria preparation of healthy plant-based meals, and then they get healthy food for the kids in the school. And contrast that with my daughter who teaches in the Burnaby school system, and the kids come to school hungry. They don't have a school food program there. And she, on a teacher's salary, is trying to bring food into the classroom so her kids are able to learn and not be hungry. And being my kid, she never grew up on anything but healthy vegetarian food. So she can't stand that what the school's able to get when they finally got on the Jordan's principle and got some food was highly processed, snacky food that can last on a shelf without refrigeration, because schools have lost all the infrastructure to be able to have a fridge and a healthy place to cook food. So this is I know I'm taking it in a different direction, but we not only have to support farmers and the plant-based food industry, we have to really examine the extent to which the industrialized corporate unhealthy food model. We talk about health food, we can also talk about sick food. Sick food gets protection. Health food doesn't get promoted, and plant-based agriculture needs a lot more financial support.
And Monsieur Perron.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette importante question. Bien sûr, il faut soutenir davantage les productions végétales. Alistair a parlé avec justesse du secteur maraîcher, entre autres, qui manque de soutien de façon désastreuse, des systèmes de gestion des risques et des entreprises qui ne fonctionnent absolument pas. Quand on dit que le programme d'urgence, qui est supposé de venir compenser tous les autres programmes qui n'ont pas fonctionné, le Agri-Relance, a pris 2 ans avant d'envoyer des sous à des entreprises. Les gens ont le temps de quitter la production dans l'intermède. Fait qu'il faut commencer à être sérieux là-dessus. Par contre, de bien le faire aussi. être vigilant parce que c'est bien, quand on dit là, dans votre introduction, c'est bon les productions végétales pour l'environnement, et deux choses. D'abord, moi, je ne vois pas ça en contradiction avec les productions animales quand ils sont de taille humaine, d'entreprise familiale. Puis il faut prendre aussi dans les mesures qu'on fait par rapport à l'agriculture l'ensemble des facteurs. Par exemple, les avantages environnementaux qu'apporte le maintien d'une prairie au niveau de la biodiversité, au niveau du gaz carbonique dans le sol et ainsi de suite. Donc, il faut avoir une mesure balancée. C'est la même chose dans les productions végétales. C'est bien le végétal, mais si on se retrouve dans un champ de monoculture intensive où on utilise massivement des pesticides et des herbicides, ben, là, peut-être que l'apport environnemental est moins intéressant. Donc, les 4 B, là, les 4 R en anglais, là, pour l'utilisation des produits phytosanitaires est essentiel. Il faut agir avec intelligence, précision, mais bien sûr, il faut davantage soutenir notre agriculture. On parle de mettre 2% du budget sur la défense, on est d'accord? Mais est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas être sérieux puis mettre plus que la moitié d'1% sur l'agriculture?
Just a follow-up question for Mr. MacGregor, and anyone else who might want to weigh in. You raised a good point about farmers on the front lines of the climate crisis, and animals we know are vulnerable too. And BC saw its largest agricultural disaster during the 2021 Abbotsford floods. So we're wondering if you and any other candidates who want to comment see a role for government to support farmers in building back better and more humane.
Yeah, and it's not only that, right? Because we had the atmospheric rivers, but we also have had devastating wildfires as well and prolonged droughts. I mean, BC just seems to be getting battered again and again. So fire is just as great a risk to animals as floods are. And when you have extended periods of drought, that often affects the feed for animals, which can drive up costs. So yeah, all of these things have to be part, right? There's no one silver bullet. It's more like a silver buckshot approach, right? Like, these are very, very complex issues, and they are going to require multiple levels of government to work together along with farmers and consumers to adequately address them for sure.
I just want to say, I mean, if we're looking at climate crisis, we have to recognize, oh, sorry. If we're looking at the climate crisis, we have to recognize the contribution of greenhouse gases from particularly the livestock operations of confined industrial feedlot operations. Agriculture as a whole is a contributor to global warming and, as we've just said, a victim of global warming. And while we're thinking about what's happened to us in British Columbia, the heat dome in 2021 killed 619 British Columbians in 4 days. But what gets covered less is it killed 3 billion sea creatures from heat. So people who are, if you're experiencing a heat dome, heat stress that's a health threat, go down to the water to try to get cool, and you can't get close to the water line because of the stench. It was only later people figured out, oh, that stench was all the animals, the sea creatures that had died from the heat. And the same thing was happening in animal barns. The heat was killing animals in the barns. So the livestock hit from climate change, yes, it was floods. Yes, it was fires, and it continues to be a threat of a heat dome. And I don't see any level of preparedness out of the federal government or provincial government. I think the government of British Columbia, by the way, Alistair, was criminally negligent in the deaths of those 619 people because the heat dome was coming. We saw it coming in weather forecasts, and the BC NDP did nothing to call it a provincial emergency so we could have saved lives. So I remain bitter and angry. My stepdaughter was one of those who nearly died, and she's in her mid-30s.
Okay, if I could, I would say 3 things. One, I would echo and we just have to be honest about the facts and the science that industrial intensive animal agriculture contributes to climate risk and it contributes to pandemic risk. And it's not about, we're not snapping our fingers. No one's saying we're going to eliminate agriculture. This is about managing and reducing risks in a responsible, evidence-based way. The second thing I will say is around emergency preparedness. Animals should be incorporated in emergency preparedness plans. Of course, they should be. And the last thing, just on support for farmers, it's interesting when there are examples and models elsewhere. So when the UK phased out fur farming, they didn't just prohibit fur farming and leave it at that. They actually transitioned farmers by effectively compensating farmers that were in the space for through the phase out. And so there are certainly models for supporting farmers to transition to other things as well, as for example with fur farming, if we were to phase out that activity.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Oh, sorry, Mr. Perron, go ahead.
Oui. Quand même une belle question, j'aimerais ça intervenir. L'environnement, c'est fondamental. On en a parlé depuis le début du débat. Vous savez, nous, on prône la décentralisation, l'encouragement des gestes environnementaux. Il faut faire confiance à nos producteurs agricoles qui ont les deux pieds sur le terrain. Ce sont les premiers qui veulent protéger la terre. Donc, décentralisons, reconnaissons les innovations environnementales avec de l'argent sonnant, concret, l'équivalent, par exemple, de 50 profits qu'on perd quand on change une pratique. Et ces sommes-là serviront de mise de fonds à la prochaine innovation. Puis laissons aller notre monde, vous allez voir qu'ils vont nous surprendre parce qu'on ne peut pas ne rien faire devant les changements climatiques. On parlait tantôt des prix à l'épicerie. Il y a une grosse part de ça qui provient des changements climatiques, des conflits aussi, mais aussi beaucoup des changements climatiques. Quand on pense à toutes les répercussions qu'il y a sur nos producteurs agricoles qui en souffrent, particulièrement les productions végétales, là, ce sont les premières victimes des changements climatiques. Donc, il faut agir de façon très urgente et continuer à travailler. Puis moi, quand j'entends des gens dire oui, mais là, c'est mondial, il y a des pays qui font rien, oui, mais ne rien faire, c'est pas acceptable non plus. Soyons des leaders mondiaux. Puis ce qui est triste en présente campagne électorale, c'est qu'à peu près toutes les formations politiques, en fait, mis à part les formations qui ne peuvent pas vraiment prétendre à prendre le gouvernement, ont abandonné la lutte au changement climatique. Et ça, je pense que c'est un mauvais choix. Peut-être qu'il y avait des choses qui étaient mal faites dans le passé, faisons-les mieux. Peut-être s'inspirer du Québec, qui a un beau.
Okay, I think there's a little freezing issue, but that's okay. We're going to move on and maybe we'll get Mr. Perron back. The next question has to do with antimicrobial resistance. It has been identified as one of the top 10 public health threats this decade. About 70% of antibiotics used globally and in Canada are administered to farm animals to stop them from becoming sick in intensive farming systems. And there is clear evidence-based solutions to reduce that antibiotic use on farms by improving conditions for animals. The question is, would your party support phasing out preventative antibiotic use through improvements in farmed animal welfare? Ms. May, we'll start with you.
Yes. It's very clear the health evidence is overwhelming. We know that and this is part of our platform. Again, it's in detail that we need to have a holistic response for animal welfare and the linkages to threats to human health as well as the well-being of the animals themselves. I think there's a trade issue here that we should be picking up on. When the U.S. Trade Secretaries, I don't know if you saw that rant, anybody saw the rant about how unfair it was that Europe doesn't want U.S. beef in Europe. Well, they also don't want Canadian beef in Europe because our beef is treated with hormones and prophylactic use of antibiotics. And there's very clear evidence from the International Agency for Research on Cancer that steroid-treated beef is a health threat, which is why there are trade barriers for Canadian beef making it to the European Union. We want to uncouple and insulate ourselves from the United States on trade issues. One thing we have to do in the interest of our own economy is to make sure that we are getting animals off drugs, basically, in intensive feedlot operations. We should end intensive feedlot operations for many reasons, including animal welfare, but also for human health. And everybody who knows that when you put a bunch of animals together where it's kids in a daycare that spread the colds all around, fish in toxic fish factories, sometimes called aquaculture, same thing with animals. That's why they're getting dosed with prophylactic use of antibiotics, and they're getting steroids to grow faster and unhealthy animals that we can't export to countries where we need to be able to have strong trading relationships. So yes, yes, and yes.
Mr. Erskine Smith?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things, starting with the government, and then I'll go to my own views. So starting with the government, we've seen action on antimicrobial resistance. I would say there's to use the jargon of the government, there's sort of a pan-Canadian strategy on this. And there's been modest but important funding first in I think 2015, but then 2021 there was about $28 million I think that went to, and you're talking about research and development, you're talking about surveillance, and there's been other dollars that have gone to international efforts as well to address this, what is a global risk. And I remember when Jane Philpott was the health minister, I remember this is years ago, obviously, and met with World Bank officials who were articulating the concern about superbugs and antimicrobial resistance and overuse of antibiotics even at that time, and the risks have not gone away. And so, yes, I think, my own personal view is, we obviously the government has a strategy in place. My own personal view is we have to take an even more concerted and ambitious effort on this. And that's partly what drove me when it came to the Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness Act, ensuring that there was a clear focus and a clear-eyed focus from the government to table a report in Parliament or a plan in Parliament to say, here's how we are going to manage and reduce risks in relation to the connection between animal health, environmental health, and human health, and pandemic risks. And how are we going to reduce those risks? And that would include taking action specifically on antimicrobial resistance.
Mr. MacGregor?
Yeah, I think I would start from, what is the worst case scenario? And the worst case scenario is getting a superbug that is resistant to our most powerful antibiotics, right? So antibiotics, right, they are effective at treating bacteria. This is not about viral diseases. This is about bacterial diseases. And again, so if that is the worst case scenario, what can we do to prevent that from happening and mitigate that? And, again, this is evolution. Bacteria multiply at such a fast rate, you are going to get those genetic mutations that allow one strain to be resistant to antibiotics, and then that strain is going to multiply, and suddenly you are caught off guard. So in any way that we can prevent the overuse of antibiotics, I have really appreciated over the years of working with organizations like the Dean's Council of agricultural universities right across the country. I think we also have to make use of the fantastic scientists that we have working in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's facilities. Like there's a great facility in Summerland, BC, and right across the country. And just really make sure that scientists with the most up-to-date knowledge have a seat at the table, and that our policy is directly following their recommendations. And yes, again, making sure that animal welfare and any conditions that lead to their reduced responses to bacterial infections are being mitigated. Absolutely. I think that's got to be a very important part of government policy going forward.
Okay. Monsieur Perron, we lost you for a moment, but the question is about phasing out preventative antibiotic use through improvements in farmed animal welfare.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Désolé pour la coupure Internet. En effet, moi, j'adhère à ce que Alistair vient de mentionner. Vous savez, personne ne voudrait abolir les antibiotiques pour les humains. Par contre, personne ne voudrait en prendre 3 fois par jour non plus. Donc, il y a quelque chose qui existe entre les deux d'intelligent, là. Plus on va limiter l'usage de ces médicaments-là, plus, premièrement, on pourra les préserver dans le long terme sans développer des résistances, puis plus aussi nos animaux seront en santé. Et avant d'aller administrer des remèdes comme ça de façon permanente, regardons c'est quoi les conditions d'élevage. Hein? Quand c'est trop intensif, quand les animaux n'ont pas d'espace de vie, quand on parle beaucoup, là, au Québec particulièrement, là, les productions laitières, entre autres, ont développé beaucoup la tabulation libre. C'est quelque chose qui change énormément la donne et qui augmente de façon importante le bien-être des animaux, donc le rendement final pour le producteur agricole. Tout le monde est gagnant là-dedans. Je ramène encore mon élément central que je ramène presque à chaque question depuis le début, le bien-être animal. Avant de prendre toute décision, il faudrait toujours se poser la question du bien-être animal et de l'assurer au maximum pour assurer les bonnes conditions. Mais clairement, c'est une problématique si on utilise ces produits-là de façon répétée. Madame May a parlé aussi des ententes de libre-échange où des viandes ne pouvaient pas entrer et tout ça. Là, ça, il y a un travail à faire là-dessus au niveau commercial également. Mais nous, je pense qu'on a une production de qualité qu'il faut préserver.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about the Canadian Centre of Alternatives to Animal Methods. Canada has made significant shifts towards more humane science by taking steps to phase out toxicity testing. That was with the passage of Bill S5 and then by the banning of testing of cosmetics on animals. However, Canada's ability to implement these new laws through the development of humane non-animal alternatives was jeopardized when the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods was forced to close its doors due to a lack of public funding. The question is, would your party support government funding to help reopen the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods? And how else might your party support the shift away from animal testing? And for this one, we'll start with Mr. MacGregor.
Yeah, great question. I think Bill S5 was great, but again, this is a two-part problem, right? It's one thing to change the legislation, but you have to back it up with resources as part of the follow-through. And when I look at that example out of the University of Windsor, that is a shame that it didn't have enough funding to keep on going. And I think that speaks to the need for a strong federal commitment, given its responsibilities, both through Health Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Those mandates from both of those departments, I think, necessitate federal funding to provide the follow-through to the legislative change that was made in Bill S5. I don't know if I have like a specific level of detail. I think just making sure that year over year stable funding is provided is the important first step, and then letting an organization, as was run out of the University of Windsor, and there could be other candidates. I'll put a plug in for the University of Victoria or UBC. Right across the country, we've got great institutions. I think that would be, I would like them to take the lead, but they need to have that government funding in place to do that important work.
Ms. May?
I'll just read from our platform. Phase out animal testing and impose a nationwide ban, funding research and promoting ethical, cruelty-free alternatives. So obviously, we would fund that research, we would reopen that center, and we've made some progress with banning the testing of animals for cosmetics and so on, but we really must pursue cruelty, animal-free, and ethical alternatives for testing.
Mr. Perron?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Madame Wong. Écoutez, moi, j'ai le goût de vous dire que c'est un peu scandaleux de baisser le financement de ces instituts de recherche-là. Le Canada est un cancre en recherche et développement. Et plutôt que d'investir davantage et essayer de rattraper le retard, on voit des coupures comme ça. Donc, le Bloc québécois avait voté en faveur du projet de loi S5 qui contenait des modifications, entre autres sur les tests de toxicité sur les animaux. Alors, évidemment, il faut éviter à tout prix ces techniques-là et développer d'autres façons de faire. On est capable, on est inventif, on est intelligent, on a parmi les meilleurs cerveaux au monde. Malheureusement, à cause du sous-financement de nos universités et de nos centres de recherche, on voit nos cerveaux déserter le pays, le Québec et le Canada. Ça n'a pas de bon sens. Alors, il faut agir là-dessus. Et clairement, nous, on est en faveur d'un financement adéquat. Recherche et développement égale avenir. Puis un jour, il faudra, comme gouvernement, arrêter de jouer de 4 ans en 4 ans pour faire des points politiques, puis essayer d'agir pour la prochaine génération. Puis agir pour la prochaine génération, c'est investir particulièrement en recherche et développement.
Mr. Erskine Smith?
Yeah, so interesting. I was just texting with Dr. Chandrasekhar about this. She has led efforts for the Center for Alternatives to Animal Methods and has rightly been frustrated and critical, and I think just generally exhausted because all that work is not being realized now that the center is shut down. And we've got to reverse course. And before we get there, I think it's important to understand when we were first elected, when I was first elected, certainly in 2015, none of this action was in place. There was no action on animal testing. And fast forward today, we've seen a prohibition on cosmetic testing, and we've seen a few things on toxicity testing on animals more broadly. We've seen legislative commitment to phase out. We've also seen a draft strategy through Health Canada to realize that legislative commitment. And now, to actually make the thing happen, we need dollars and cents behind that draft strategy. And, at the moment, the best party commitment that I've got is to explore the mechanism because, there are a few different ways you could imagine realizing this, whether directly in a budget or through CIHR. There are a few different ways you can imagine realizing the funding. And I'll just say my personal commitment is to make sure that center is reopened and to make sure that we are putting our spending power behind an initiative like this to realize the promise of the strategy, but also to do our part because other countries, the US, other countries in the EU are really committed to phasing out toxicity testing, and they are putting their dollars and cents in research and development behind it.
Okay, thank you. We've all sort of touched on this subject, but just to dig a little bit deeper, the next question, in recent years, there's been a trend towards the creation of government agencies or entities whose exclusive mandate is animal welfare, independent of any sort of conflicting economic interests. As an example of this conflict, Agriculture Canada, they're responsible for the welfare of farmed animals, but on the other hand, their mandate is to create the conditions for the long-term profitability of Canada's agricultural sector. So do you see any problem with the way that animal welfare is positioned within federal institutions? If you do, how would you address that? We'll start with Mr. Erskine Smith.
Right. So I'll use an example of a clear-eyed problem, I think. And you mentioned the CFIA. Well, the CFIA has done an incredibly poor job of enforcing existing rules in relation to the live export of horses for slaughter. They've sort of thrown up their hands and said nothing we can do. And we should have had regulations in place that are stronger, sure, but they could have done a lot more with the regs that are there. The second example I would give is in relation to transparency and consumer protections. You have a situation where when it comes to free-range eggs, for example, there is massive consumer confusion when it comes to the sustainability and humanity of egg production as between different producers and the way that they're advertised to consumers, and massive confusion for consumers. And what was CFIA focused on? They were focused on consumer confusion where there was no evidence of consumer confusion, but they were focused on doing a consultation on consumer confusion in relation to plant-based eggs. Okay, so here's a real problem. We have evidence of consumer confusion at scale, and they're not focused on that at all, but they're focused on consumer confusion, no evidence at all in plant-based eggs. So, that's just one example, but it's indicative of the challenge. As to the solution, I'll just say what I would love to see from a systemic perspective, and Humane Canada put this forward as a platform proposal, and a number of animal advocacy organizations were putting good ideas on the table, but this one came from Humane Canada. I think we should have a parliamentary committee that sits down, a member from every party that sits down. We hear from different stakeholders, both on the ag side and the animal welfare side and everyone in between. And we come up with unanimous recommendations for how we can improve animal welfare in this country, including taking action on some of these more systemic challenges. And I think instead of a piecemeal approach where you have one bill here and one bill there, a more comprehensive look from a parliamentary committee, a special parliamentary committee that makes recommendations that are then acted on by the government, would go much faster and further.
À moi? OK. Je n'ai pas votre son. J'espère que vous m'entendez.
Pardon me.
OK.
Mr.
C'est
MacGregor,
moi?
you're next. Pardon
OK.
me.
Monsieur MacGregor.
Okay, was it? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so we've had a similar problem with another ministry, DFO, right? It's got one of those dual purposes. Part of its mandate is looking after fish and fish habitat, but it's also responsible for like commercial fish licensing, and sometimes that can pull the ministry in two different and sometimes conflicting positions. And as a long-standing member of the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, we also recognize the problems with CFIA, which also has its foot in two different ministries. There is Health Canada, there's also the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food. So I think, yes, creation of a single purpose federal institution, I don't know whether it's a parliamentary committee or an agency of the federal government that has animal welfare as its core mandate, that could clear up a lot of the confusion. And I think I'd be very open to exploring that as an option. There's a number of different ways we can approach this. It's either, you could take an existing organization like the National Farm Animal Care Council, you could beef that up, or you could create a separate entity. There's a number of different ways you can do this, but yes, I do agree with the premise of the question in that there are examples where having multiple mandates in one organization can lead to a lot of conflicts down the road.
Thank you, Ms. May.
Well, there's a clear conflict of interest. Certainly, Alistair mentioned DFO, but their worst conflict of interest is they both promote fish aquaculture and are supposed to regulate it. It definitely is the case with agriculture and agri-food. They're promoting cheap food exports. So that's their major goal. And there are a lot of stories about how this went when we got rid of the crow rate, and that was to help farmers ship grain out of the prairies. That was a long time ago, but the impact of that was that grain was piling up in the prairies. So that gave birth to one of the most egregiously cruel production methods for livestock, the mega hog barn. So they export hogs instead of grain, and the cruelty of those barns is unspeakable. Look, this is green policy, again, from our platform. Create an independent ministry responsible for animal welfare, separate from agriculture and agri-food. That gets rid of the conflict of interest. Implement comprehensive animal welfare legislation that mandates humane treatment standards for all farm animals. These two steps would be comprehensive, effective, and are totally possible.
Okay, Monsieur Perron.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour l'intéressante question. Écoutez, la rentabilité et le bien-être animal, ce n'est pas contradictoire. Au contraire, ça va ensemble. Nous, on est bien ouvert là, à une approche empirique où on pourrait coordonner ça, pour le bien-être animal. Par contre, je considère le bien-être animal comme l'environnement. Il devrait être au centre de chaque décision. Donc, de créer une organisation parallèle, on va se retrouver encore avec des ministères séparés. Il faut que Agriculture agroalimentaire Canada priorise le bien-être animal et l'environnement en même temps dans chacune des décisions. Je vous donne l'exemple. J'ai parlé tantôt de la stabulation libre pour les vaches laitières. Les vaches sont mieux, puis ils produisent davantage. Donc, il n'y a pas de contradiction entre le bien-être animal et la rentabilité. Au contraire, je voudrais revenir sur ce que M. Erskine Smith a mentionné au niveau de l'exportation des chevaux. Il faut être sérieux. Puis quand on met quelque chose dans une lettre de mandat d'un ministre, moi, je ne comprends pas que ce soit un projet de loi privé qui dépose ce projet de loi-là. On connaît d'autant plus le mépris du Sénat envers les projets de loi privés. Il y a un mépris épouvantable. Donc, il faut que ce soit des projets de loi gouvernementaux si on veut qu'ils avancent. Et j'invite M. Erskine Smith à travailler de l'intérieur pour, lors de la reprise des travaux en Chambre, qu'on soit là ou non, là, nous deux, il va y avoir des gens en place. Il faut que le gouvernement se saisisse de ces questions-là. Puis j'offre gracieusement notre projet de loi sur la gestion de l'offre aussi. Quand on parle de bien-être animal, là, des fermes, vous savez qu'il y a 3 fermes différentes aux États-Unis qui pourraient fournir tous les œufs du Canada. Une seule de ces fermes-là. Par contre, quand la grippe aviaire rentre là-dedans, on parlait de santé publique, toutes les questions qu'on se pose aujourd'hui sont interreliées. Il n'y a pas de questions séparées des autres. Et quand la grippe aviaire rentre là-dedans, aujourd'hui, aux États-Unis, ils payent leur douzaine d'œufs 15 $ à peu près. Là. Alors, quand les gens viennent nous dire que la gestion de l'offre, c'est coûteux pour le consommateur, c'est absolument faux. Il n'y a pas de subvention aussi en amont, alors qu'aux États-Unis, quand quelqu'un va acheter une pelle de lait, il l'a déjà payé en subvention. Donc, il faut donner l'information en transparence. Puis, je répète encore une fois, le bien-être animal, ça augmente la rentabilité, ça ne la diminue pas.
There you go. I'm on mute. I want to ask a question from, I was going to move to media questions, but let's get through a couple more here. These are more specific about legislation, criminal code questions. The first one is about the fact that animals, they are sentient beings. It's not recognized anywhere in federal legislation, including in the Criminal Code of Canada, which still treats animals as property. So what would your party do to strengthen legislation, federal legislation around treating animals as sentient with regard to protecting animal well-being? And for that one, we'll start with Monsieur Perron.
Oui, je peux y aller là-dessus. Écoutez, moi, je suis quand même assez heureux de vous confirmer que le gouvernement du Québec a voté en décembre 2015 une loi à l'unanimité sur le bien-être animal et la sécurité de l'animal qui reconnaît que les animaux sont des êtres doués de sensibilité et qui ont des impératifs biologiques. Donc, quand je parle de l'avancement, moi, j'invite toutes les législations à adopter une telle loi. Donc, vous comprendrez qu'on est très favorable à ça. Le seul enjeu que nous, on aura comme membre du Bloc québécois, c'est si on vient à essayer d'effacer les lois québécoises. Donc, moi, si je suis en compatibilité, en complémentarité, on essaie de créer une homogénéité à travers le Canada. Là-dessus, on est d'accord, mais il faut qu'on laisse les champs de compétences. Mais bien sûr que oui, il faut légiférer là-dessus. Les animaux sont des êtres sensibles et on ne devrait pas accepter dans une société en 2025 qu'il y ait de la maltraitance sans conséquence.
And Mr. Erskine Smith.
So I'll start with the science of it because it's a useful place to start, which is animals are sentient and they think, love, feel, and they obviously deserve our compassion. And the laws should reflect that reality. Of course they should. Now, when it comes to the criminal code, this is how Elizabeth was sort of dredging up old memories. This does as well because the bill that I introduced in early 2016 after my first getting elected in October 2015, I really went back to different bills that had been introduced that almost had become law. And there was one bill on addressing animal cruelty through the criminal code that had been introduced by Liberal Justice Ministers Irwin Cotler, Martin Cochon, and McClellan. It had been debated in Parliament up and down over and over again. And there was just a consistent conservative misinformation. And look, it gets down to the level where it would be in an agricultural magazine, and then I would start getting asked questions about it by people who were genuinely confused and genuinely concerned that it might impact their livelihoods. And so we have to be careful in politics about how we frame things. But in the criminal code, animals in the property section doesn't make sense. It should be a standalone section for cruelty to animals. Of course it should, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about cruelty to property. That's not why it's in the criminal code. But there's, in my experience and the experience that even came before me, there's just a consistent difficulty of making that change. And so I would say Quebec was able to do this because Quebec was able to recognize sentience through by saying this is an approach we're taking that wasn't impacting existing criminal code legislation that had existed for hundreds of years. And so my only caution, I suppose, on this is in politics, you want to be pragmatic enough to say, is the outcome, are we going to see results because of the change that are going to be commensurate and worthwhile given all the challenges we're going to confront in getting this political change through? And on that, I don't know. It's obviously, of course, animals are sentient. I just honestly, I would want to, if I were to go back and think through it again, would I have taken on that exact same fight and sent the bill sideways in some ways? I would want to be crystal clear that I was going to see not just a important symbolic change nonetheless, but a more substantive change that would improve the lives for animals. So of course we need to recognize the sentience of animals. I just don't know the criminal code becomes the mechanism to do that.
Mr. MacGregor?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who has worked around animals, you can absolutely recognize sentience. You know that animals have a range of emotional responses to the conditions that they're in. That much is just plainly obvious. I think the way I would approach this is, when we talk about the criminal code, we have to recognize that number one, it's a reactive instrument, right? So it usually comes into play after the fact. Now, that's not to say that it's not important. I think that is an important part of the legislative tools that we have at our disposal, particularly as federal politicians. But I'm also interested in the other side is the proactiveness. So what measures can we put into place so that the criminal code, while sometimes necessary, is not relied on 100% of the time? And I think in that case, it comes down to the welfare of animals. And I think the welfare of animals to respect that sentience, to respect the emotional range that they have, to respect the living conditions they have, we need to put a lot of effort also into the proactive side to make sure that welfare standards have proper oversight, that we are encouraging folks to adopt standard codes of practice that are universally agreed upon and are backed up by the best science surrounding the issue of animal welfare. So that's how I would like to approach it. I would just like to say that the criminal code is important, but I'm just wary of relying too much on after the fact legislation. I'm much more interested in also the proactive nature of it as well.
Ms. May?
I think we need to do both. We need to have legislation that recognizes that animals are sentient beings under Canadian law. But an argument that's very strong for the criminal code is that dangerous psychopaths who go on to kill humans start with torturing animals. Police will tell you this in every community. So let's do both. Let's have one piece of legislation that recognizes that animals are sentient beings. Many things will flow from that. In the same time, or subsequently, we amend the criminal code to take animals out of the property section and significantly increase the seriousness with which criminal justice takes cruelty towards animals, particularly where it's deliberate or sadistic. And that will perhaps definitely nip in the bud the kind of desperately ill people who go on to kill people. That's an argument that doesn't scare farmers. That's an argument that doesn't go right to the heart of people thinking that this is a slippery slope. This is about identifying threats to a community and security and safety. And that's an argument where I know the police chiefs will back us up.
Okay, thank you. I want to move to a question from Liam Casey at the Canadian Press. He would like to know what each of the parties will do for the belugas at Marineland in Niagara Falls, Ontario. The belugas are dying at an alarming rate. And specifically for Nate, why hasn't his government done anything to help those remaining belugas? So, Mr. Erskine Smith, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things here. I mean, the legislative effort that Willie Moore ultimately started and Murray Sinclair concluded in the Senate, and then Elizabeth and I played a small role in sort of jointly seconding and making sure that the party was supportive of it as much as I could. That was an important step, and the challenge, of course, is that people will rightly throw up their hands and say, "Hang on a second, but marine land still exists," and because the existing animals were grandfathered. And so, what happens? Well, I think there's two things that functionally have to happen. One, where they're transferring those animals, we have to make sure that DFO takes a very firm view that everything has to be in the best interest of those animals, because in transportation there are great risks to these animals even. And the second piece is there's an effort to realize a sanctuary in Nova Scotia. And in the discussions that I've had with those that are behind the sanctuary, they're actually not looking for federal funding. Where we could support efforts, though, is helping to pay for the transportation in a secure and safe way. And so as the sanctuary is established, I think that is the critical role that we can and should play, and that DFO, frankly, should play in making sure that we're realizing the efforts of the sanctuary and those behind it, but also realizing the best interests of these animals.
Ms. May?
Yeah, it's an incredible tragedy that after all the work done through Parliament to ban the keeping of cetaceans in captivity, that and as Nate correctly recalls, there was a grandfathering for existing whales. We need to get them to sanctuaries. There's 18 belugas that have died at Marineland since 2019. This is not acceptable. So it will take funding to assist moving those animals as compassionately and carefully as possible. Again, the legislation S203 speaks to the best interests of the individual animal. So moving them compassionately, carefully to a sanctuary area is the solution. It should be done as soon as possible for the remaining cetaceans at Marineland. Marineland was really brilliant. I have to say that the Senate, the conservative senators on S203 used to wonder how did they manage to get captured so effectively by Marineland, but it took a while to get the bill through because of the opposition and the conservative senators. Now the bill is law. We need to rescue those animals from Marineland as compassionately and quickly as possible.
Mr. MacGregor?
Yeah, I don't know if I can add much to what both Elizabeth and Nathaniel already voiced, other than, I was proud to be a supporter of Bill S203 in the 42nd Parliament. And I think, yeah, we did our part legislatively, but obviously more needs to be done. And I'm not as familiar with the story as others coming from British Columbia, but I think the track record of just the sheer number of deaths at Marineland amongst these animals, and the fact that Parliament has already given a voice that we condemn this kind of behavior, and we've actually passed a law to forbid it from happening in the future. It's now incumbent upon existing ministries of the federal government to step up, and as has already been mentioned, DFO is the first one that comes to mind to make sure that we're looking after these animals' needs in a proper way.
Monsieur Perron?
Oui, ben merci beaucoup pour la question. Écoutez, je suis un peu dans dans la même situation que Alistair étant de l'extérieur, mais ce que je comprends de la situation, c'est que c'est un drame épouvantable et on doit prendre soin de ces animaux-là. Vous savez, quand on a des animaux en captivité comme ça, puis qui sont pas bien, faut regarder les options qu'on a. Si on peut les remettre en liberté, ce serait l'idéal. Malheureusement, quand les animaux ont vécu longtemps en captivité comme ça, parfois c'est impossible. Donc, probablement que l'hypothèse soulevée là, par Mme May sur le sanctuaire, ce serait la meilleure solution là, pour mettre fin à cette situation-là. Puis, comme État, comme gouvernement, est-ce qu'on peut aussi agir? Je vais ramener encore mon message de agir pour la prochaine génération, ou pour pas plus tard que dans 4 ans. Essayons de voter ou de travailler en fonction de prévenir des situations désastreuses comme celle-là dans le futur.
All right, the next question is the Globe and Mail, Marie Wolf. Do the panel members have a view on Canada allowing macaques from Cambodia to be imported to Charles River Laboratories in Canada, despite restrictions on their import in the US following evidence that some may have been born in the wild? Ms. May, I'll start with you.
Yes, we have a view on that, and thanks to Marie Wolf from the Globe and Mail, we would not support the importation of macaques from Cambodia into Canada for the reasons that are implicit in the information that we know they were taken from the wild, and they should be able to remain there in their natural habitat.
Mr. MacGregor?
Yeah, that's coming down to a level of specificity that you probably won't see in any party's proposal, but I think it covers the same ground as one of the first questions that was asked when this debate began, which was on the international wildlife trade. And again, I think there are so many ways that we can learn about animals without having to remove them from their natural habitats. We've already talked about the risks associated with the international wildlife trade. So I think I would find myself on side with the researchers who have been urging the federal government to act on this matter.
Monsieur Perron?
Oui, ben un peu comme ce qu'Alistair vient de mentionner, ça touche beaucoup les premières questions dont on a traité ce matin, ce midi par contre, pardon, sur le commerce international, les risques pour la santé et ainsi de suite. Donc, par cohérence avec ce que tout le monde a dit tantôt, je pense que condamne la présence d'animaux qui ont été pris en liberté et faudrait aussi intervenir pour ne pas que ça se reproduise. Et même à ça, au-delà de ça, là, s'ils sont rendus dans le laboratoire, quel est le traitement que reçoivent ces macaques-là? On a parlé tantôt aussi des tests alternatifs pour éviter la cruauté envers les animaux. Donc, ça touche plusieurs dossiers, là. Je pense que c'est une question importante que vous soulevez.
Mr. Erskine Smith?
Right. So, I mean, Canada is a signatory to the Convention to Protect Endangered Species, CITES, and the Secretariat to CITES has recommended that there be a suspension of trade, and we should follow that recommendation. We're a signatory to CITES. We should be prioritizing the protection of endangered species, and we should suspend that trade.
Okay, the next question is from Miranda Anthistle with Global News, and she wants to know, as it sits in Canada, we have ag-gag laws, which have been put in place to prohibit recording at factory farms and fur farms. Animal activists will say these laws are unjust and in place to only protect the Canadian agriculture industry. Where does your party stand when it comes to these ag-gag laws? Mr. MacGregor, I'll start with you.
Yeah, we had an example in the previous parliament with John Barlow, a Conservative MP, and his bill C-275. So I initially voted in favor of that bill at second reading because I wanted to have a close examination of it at committee. It did not pass muster with me after our committee hearings, and so therefore the NDP voted against it at third reading. The problem is that bills like C-275, first of all, veer into the jurisdiction of the province. It's not a valid exercise of federal criminal law power. The second part is that it identifies people who are not on a farming property with lawful excuse and intent, when in fact the research shows, because they put this under the rubric of biosecurity concerns. The research shows that most of the biosecurity outbreaks on farms have actually been caused by people who were there with lawful authority and excuse. So one of the amendments I tried to make to Bill C-275 was to make its provisions apply to everyone equally, including on-farm employees. Because if we are serious about tackling biosecurity, we should make it applicable to everyone. Unfortunately, most of the committee voted against that amendment, and therefore, when the bill came to third reading, I could not support it because it was quite obvious, to me at least, that the bill was using biosecurity as a cover and in fact designed for one purpose, and it veered into the trespass jurisdiction of the provinces.
Okay, Mr. Perron.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Effectivement, on a travaillé sur un projet de loi semblable. Il faut faire la part des choses entre les intrusions et la protection des animaux. Nous, on a voté en faveur effectivement de ça parce qu'on voulait protéger nos producteurs agricoles d'une forme d'agression, parce que ça en est une. Par contre, ça ne veut pas dire qu'on n'est pas pour le bien-être animal. Ce qu'il faut assurer, puis ce qu'on a fait comme vérification, c'est que les agences, quand on porte plainte, quand on a un doute, plutôt que les citoyens soient dans l'obligation d'aller occuper l'endroit pour prendre des images, pour faire une démonstration, il faut que les agences à qui on se réfère soient efficaces dans leur inspection. Parce qu'il n'y a aucune tolérance pour le bien-être animal, de réduire le bien-être animal. Ça, c'est très, très important. Je l'ai répété plusieurs fois aujourd'hui. Mais on ne pense pas que la bonne façon de faire, c'est de faire des intrusions sur les fermes.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
We have confidentiality rules, and then we have exceptions to those rules for whistleblowing. We have trespassing rules, and then there are exceptions to those rules for undercover investigations in the public interest. And to the extent that ag-gag legislation is eliminating the idea of undercover investigations in the public interest, we should all be opposed to that kind of legislation. And look, biosecurity is important on farms. Of course it is. I introduced legislation that in the Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness Act that spoke specifically to the need to improve biosecurity, especially on industrial, intensive agriculture, animal agriculture farming operations. Alistair's right. The biosecurity risk is not from undercover investigators who are exposing animal cruelty. That just is that the facts do not bear that out. And so, look, the bill at best is virtue signaling. It doesn't add anything, and at its worst, it is a detriment to the public interest.
Okay. I do want to get to one audience question. I'll just ask that.
Is there time for me to answer that one?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. May. Did I miss you? My apologies. Go ahead.
Well, it's okay. Well, since all members of the NDP voted for C-205, I appreciate hearing Alistair's explanation at second reading, and Bloc Québécois voted for it at second reading. Most Conservatives did as well. The Green Party opposed it from the get-go. It was transparently an effort to suppress free speech, to shield the industry from having people see what goes on. So ag-gag laws are not
Oh, I think we lost Ms. May. She's frozen. If we get her back, we'll let her finish her thoughts. But in the meantime,
free speech.
Oh, there she is.
Elle est revenue.
Did you want to finish your thought? I think we missed the last sentence of yours.
Fine.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I said this was a transparent attempt to suppress free speech. Greens opposed C-205 at second reading, and right down the line, it was not about John Barlow's fig leaf excuses for why it was needed. It was never needed. There's ways to protect farms from illegal trespass, and C-205 was clearly not something that anyone should have voted for at any stage. Sorry for freezing there for a bit. Thank you.
Okay, the final question, it comes from the audience. Just ask the candidates keep their answers really brief on this one so we can get to closing remarks. The question from the audience is, in many parts of Canada, landlords can refuse to rent you an apartment if you have a pet. The renters market is already a mess, so this leads to the abandonment of pets. What are you going to do about it as a federal government with influence over provinces through the federal housing funding? For this one, we'll start with Ms. May.
It's a tough one because of federal jurisdiction being so limited in this area. As someone who's never lived without a dog being part of my family, I've faced this a lot when I was a single mom trying to find a place to live so we didn't have to give up our dog. It's a question of I think it's a question of rights for renters, but landlords have the upper hand in every case, and there are really strict provisions around a lot of leases I've had to sign in order to be allowed to have a dog with me. And the abandonment of pets because of landlord rules is a real tragedy, and it does take work, but I think it's mostly in the provincial domain. So what we would do is continue to work, if we could attach it as a condition for federally funded housing, that at least we can do because that's federal.
Mr. MacGregor?
Yeah, it is a tough one because of the jurisdiction. You know, certainly the NDP has been very active in trying to protect renters' rights. We have been very critical of, you know, corporate landlords buying up affordable housing stock and rent evicting folks. So, I mean, there's a few possibly financial tools that you can use, but it's really tough. And, you know, I think I'll echo all of my colleagues in saying that one of my favorite parts about door knocking during a federal campaign is meeting everyone's pets. And so many wonderful cats and dogs are the first ones to greet you when you press the doorbell. And it just really is lovely. But yeah, it's really tough. I mean, especially for people who are living by themselves, that's their only companion in life. And, you know, when you're on a fixed income and you have limited options available to you, that's just another barrier that you're setting up to folks. So that is a consideration. It's very tough as a federal politician to get to that level of specificity.
Okay, Monsieur Perron.
Oui, je crois que c'est à moi. Écoutez, je vais rejoindre un peu mes collègues. C'est quand même une question qui est délicate à cause des juridictions. En ayant dit ça, maintenant, je vais répondre sur le fond ou sur une base plus personnelle. Je crois que il faudrait que ce soit permis. Évidemment, dans la mesure où l'animal de compagnie n'est pas nuisible, où il n'est pas agressif pour les voisins, où il ne hurle pas toute la nuit. Là, tu sais, il faut toujours avoir de la mesure dans la vie. Mais l'aspect de l'animal de compagnie, pour la personne qui est seule, le concept aussi de zoothérapie, hein, c'est très important. Puis ça a beaucoup de répercussions, ces restrictions-là, parce que le 1er juillet au Québec, j'imagine que c'est partout ailleurs, au Canada aussi, on a un taux d'abandon d'animaux domestiques qui est effrayant. Et ça a des impacts importants. Ça mène souvent à des euthanasies, ou encore on va le replacer dans une autre maison, mais ça pourra peut-être des fois pas fonctionner, alors que l'animal, ben, il apportait une belle compagnie à la personne. Donc, c'est de la mesure, évidemment, de la compassion. Et je ne sais pas comment on peut agir là-dessus sans arriver dans les juridictions du Québec et des provinces, là. Mais il y a une ouverture là-dessus, bien évidemment.
Mr. Erskine Smith?
So a few things. One, Ontario is a jurisdiction that has rules in place that says you can't discriminate against tenants who have pets. Why? Because pets are members of the family, and it's outrageous to discriminate on that basis. And so I think all provincial jurisdictions should adopt the rule that Ontario currently has. The sky hasn't fallen. It's a good thing for tenants. On that, I did sponsor a petition that called for including this rule in our Tenants' Bill of Rights. And the challenge, and others have articulated this already on jurisdiction, that Tenants' Bill of Rights was before my time, before I became housing minister. I've only been the minister for a few short months. My joke is I've served for 4 months as housing minister, but under 2 prime ministers. And that's all to say, like this is before my time, but when you look at the Tenants' Bill of Rights, it's pretty high level. Like it's a blueprint. It doesn't get into the specificity required to address something like this. And so I think from a federal perspective, you've got to use your convening power through, bringing the housing ministers together. And security of tenure is not a federal responsibility, but it is something that should be on the table in those conversations in the renewal of the national housing strategy. And an issue like this should be, of course, on the table to say, what are best practices across jurisdictions? The federal government can convene and can pull those best practices together, and then to say to other provinces, here, we encourage you to do this as we renew the national housing strategy.
Okay, that concludes the questions, and I want to give everyone here an opportunity to make closing remarks to the audience that is watching. And for that, you have a minute. Mr. Perron, I'll start with you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Wong. C'était un débat très agréable. J'apprécie beaucoup l'invitation qu'on a eue. J'espère qu'on a pu répondre à l'ensemble des questions pour vous éclairer sur les positions des différents partis politiques. Je déplore bien sûr l'absence d'une de ces formations politiques-là, mais bon, chacun vit avec ses choix. D'ici là, écoutez, on a une élection importante dans quelques jours à peine. Donc, j'invite tous les gens qui ont écouté le débat à aller se prononcer en faisant un X à l'endroit de leur choix. Bien sûr, chacun de nous, différemment, vous dira de faire le X à un endroit différent, mais on s'entend pour dire que la participation démocratique est essentielle. Donc, vous pouvez compter sur les gens du Bloc québécois dans l'avenir pour continuer à prioriser le bien-être animal. Comme je vous ai dit, la plupart de nos politiques, nos propositions sont en ligne avec ça, puis ils prennent ça en considération. Donc, quand on parle de transformation régionale, quand on parle de consommation locale, quand on parle de préserver la gestion de l'eau, ça, j'invite les gens qui nous écoutent là, à prêter attention à cet aspect-là. Là. On va ramener ça dans la première semaine, puis ça préserve non seulement des tailles d'entreprises agricoles qui ont de l'allure pour le bien-être animal, mais ça préserve aussi les milieux ruraux, non pas seulement du Québec, mais de l'ensemble du Canada. C'est une loi essentielle. Je relance mon appel à mon nouvel ami, M. Erskine Smith, de prendre à bras-le-corps ce projet de loi-là. Nous, on ne veut pas nécessairement que notre nom soit écrit en dessous. On veut que la loi soit adoptée afin de protéger nos collectivités. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Mr. MacGregor.
Yeah, thank you very much for hosting this important debate. It is a shame that there is one party missing in action, but I'm very glad for the conversation today. And, I would also like to thank the various organizations who care very deeply about animal welfare for the principled stands they've taken, for the great committee interventions that they've made, whether it's an examination of legislation or the various reports that we've done at the Agriculture Committee. Your advice and insight and expertise has always been very valued. And look, I think animal welfare as a subject obviously is very important to a lot of Canadians. It should be a top line agenda item for anything that we do from the federal government's perspective. And there are, when it comes to farming practices, I just want everyone listening to know there are a lot of farmers who are really leading the way in this. They care deeply about their animals, and it's not like the what and the why, but it's the how they're farmed. So I would just we have to, as a Canadian society, find a way to bring all of these different voices to the table to chart a path forward and look at examples that are already being done. There's some incredible people out there who are really pioneering this. And it's just a very real privilege for me, not only as the representative of a very beautiful riding out here on Vancouver Island, but also someone who has been involved on the agriculture file for quite some time now to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for hosting us. And more importantly, thank you to everyone who's listening today.
Ms. May?
Thanks. I really want to thank the organizations involved here, that Animal Justice, Montreal, SPCA, Vancouver Humane Society, the BC SPCA, and World Animal Protection for your advocacy all the time and not just during elections. This has been a rare chance. This is my first national debate with other parties in this entire election as co-leader of the Green Party, with the Greens having the strongest platform on animal welfare. Every single Green candidate across Canada is backed by a platform that calls for strong advocacy and action and legislative change within Canada to recognize animals as sentient beings, to concern ourselves with their welfare, yes, to transition farming practices to ones that are humane, not to shut down farming, but to ensure that it's compassionate and humane, remembering Gandhi's words that you judge a society by how it treats its animals. We as a country can do better. Canadians support us moving forward to protect animal welfare. And if elected, I certainly will, and my colleagues across the country in the Green Party will as well. Thank you.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
Well, thanks so much for hosting. Look, animal protections should not be a partisan issue, and I hope you've seen a sense of collaboration across party lines here. My commitment to you is I will continue to be a voice for animals so long as I am in Parliament. On a personal note, I have worked with colleagues here on your screen across party lines. I'll continue to do so, and I'll work in my caucus too. I mean, I helped found the Liberal Animal Welfare Caucus. We've worked across, through a more open, all-party animal welfare caucus. We've done a lot of good. There are colleagues in the Liberal Party like Julie DeBruzen who are stand shoulder to shoulder in getting this work done. So I think those sort of personal efforts should be recognized, and there are certain voices that stand out more than others. I think on a party basis, though, look, and not to put too fine a point on it, you have a situation where every single time a piece of legislation stalled, it was because of Conservatives. Every single time a piece of animal legislation in particular stalled, it was because of the Conservative Senate leader, Don Plett. I can't put it more bluntly than that. Like it's a conservative, not someone low on the totem pole. The highest person in the Conservative Party in the Senate was specifically tasked with blocking animal welfare and animal protection legislation. And you contrast that with look, we're ready to work across party lines, but you contrast that with a Liberal government that has seen action to address animal cruelty in the criminal code, that has passed laws on that has seen action to support Elizabeth's efforts to ban cetaceans in captivity, action to ban cosmetic testing on animals, to phase out toxicity testing on animals, to ban shark finning. You've got commitments in the course of this election, and they're commitments from the party, not just me, to ban live export of horses for slaughter, to reinstate and to pass S15, the Jane Goodall Act, to address the wildlife trade. And look, I'm not suggesting progress is perfect, but we've seen more action on animals from this Liberal government than any government in my lifetime. And you contrast that with the ready alternative in this election that actively impedes these efforts. I hope the choice for those listening, I hope the choice is a clear one.
Okay, thank you so much for everyone joining us here today, for tuning in. On behalf of Animal Justice, Montreal, SPCA, Vancouver Humane Society, World Animal Protection, and the BC SPCA, we thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Take care.
Carmen, thank you for being a wonderful moderator.
Yeah, thank you.
My
Thank you.
pleasure.
That was great.